Hello and welcome to another one in our series of videos on the Scottish Wars of Independence. This video deals with the events of 1309 through to 1314 and the renewal of Bruce's war with England. The aim of this video is to learn how Bruce fought to push the English out of Scotland in the years 1309 through to 1314. By the end of it, we should be able to describe how Bruce overcame English control of Scotland in those years and be able to explain why he used guerrilla tactics to capture enemy strongholds. We'll also be able to explain why Edward didn't prevent Bruce's attacks upon his Scottish strongholds during those years and seemingly allowed Bruce's power to expand. As always, this is a series of videos that supports the Higher History course, although anyone who's interested may find that useful. For students of Higher History, they will find it useful to record the information in bold and notes to support their studies. So, on with today's video. Edward II returns. Now, before we move on with today's video content, a little bit of recap of where we got to in our last video. 1308 through to 1309, Bruce campaigned in northeast of Scotland against his main rival for the crown. He destroyed the Comyn family and their heartlands of Buchan and Moray before moving west to take on the MacDougall clan, who were close allies of the Commons, destroying their lands throughout Argyll. Whilst doing this, his allies, Douglas and his younger brother Edward Bruce, also took out the remaining Comyn strongholds in the southwest of Scotland in Galloway. Now, to put the cherry on the cake, Bruce held his first parliament in St Andrews in 1309 to accept the acclamation of the Scottish Lords, although at this point he still does not control the entirety of Scotland. So with Bruce's civil war in Scotland over by 1309, he is able to turn his attentions on the English strongholds and their garrisons still remaining in Scotland. And the English still controlled a sizable chunk of the kingdom. Edward II still had a number of Scottish lords who were loyal to him. Men such as Patrick, the Earl of Dunbar, and William Soles of Liddesdale held considerable lands in the south and east of Scotland in Edward's name. This picture here is a reconstruction of Dunbar Castle by Andrew Spratt. Dunbar Castle is one of the most formidable strongholds in medieval Scotland. Well, if you visit it today, you wouldn't guess that by the blasted remains that you would see in the kind of quaint harbour town. At this time, though, it very much is the key to the access of Edinburgh, and Bruce needs to take that fortress if he is to make Edinburgh a safe stronghold of his own in the years to come. At this point, Edinburgh is still held by the English, of course. So in 1309, Bruce began a sustained campaign of attacks against English loyalists in Scotland. These took the form of lightning raids into enemy territory, driving off livestock and extorting payments in grain and gold as blackmail in return for truces. Now this is key to Bruce's campaign. This is going to bring the wayward Scots over to hopefully his own leadership, as he's trying to prove here and undermine English control, but he's also trying to show these Scots that the English lords cannot protect them. They cannot protect them from Bruce's attentions, and that the obvious choice is for these Scots to come across and swear fealty to him instead. By attacking them and ravaging these lands in this way, he's stealing their resources, so he's bringing economic hardship to them, but he's also bringing hunger to them. Now, these resources Bruce can use himself to feed his own men, saving money and his own people, or to give out as gifts, winning favour from his people, or he can sell them to make money to pay for his campaigns, which would have been ruinously expensive. So the aim of these attacks is to impoverish the communities of his enemies and resupply Bruce's own forces, whilst demonstrating the inability of Edward to protect his own supporters. So Bruce is building up his prestige here. So the complaints of the men of Lothian persuaded Edward II to raise another army to invade northwards from Berwick in 1310 and 1311. Now, Edward's efforts were hampered by the refusal of many of his lords to serve alongside his despised favourite, Piers Gaveston. The invading army was comparatively small for its time, and money was tight. Now, in comparison to, let's say, for instance, the Battle of Falkirk, where the English had something in the region of 12,000 men under Edward I when they came north and did battle with Wallace in 1298, or later on in our series of events, we haven't quite got there yet, but the Battle of Bannockburn, the English are going to show up within the region of 20,000 men. Edward's army for this campaign is around 4,700 strong. Now that's pretty small in terms of what the English can turn out for a royally led campaign at this time. And this is symptomatic of what's going on in England. Edward II had argued with his barons since 1308 on raising taxes to fund a campaign into Scotland. The funds he did manage to gather together are not great, hence the size of this army. So 4,700 men is not far off, I imagine, what Bruce could possibly drag together himself. But would Bruce have faced an even fight? He's probably learned his lesson at this point, that he only is going to fight if the odds are heavily in his favour. So whether or not a battle would have come off in this campaign. So Edward made a few expeditions with this army into Lothian, but Bruce refused to face him in open battle. Bruce is not going to risk it at this point. He's worked too hard for it all to be thrown away in a straight fight. So on the 1st of October 1310, Bruce tries something else. He wrote to Edward in an attempt to establish peace between Scotland and England. Now this is a fascinating document. This is, in terms of the historiography and what we know of this period, this is relatively new, which is fascinating. This was only found in the records of the British Library in 2013 by Professor Dovet Brune of the University of Glasgow. Now, he discovered the letter in his own research, and he believes that Bruce is here fishing to feel out Edward's position rather than actually expecting a genuine negotiation to begin between the two kings. By this point, Bruce had established himself in Scotland, whilst Edward was very much in the north of England to avoid mounting friction with his own barons in southern England, so he's kind of trying to keep his head down. The letter was written at Kildrum in the parish of Cumbernauld, so just south of Glasgow by the Bruce. Now, Edward obviously did not reply favourably to this letter. There'd be no peace, but neither would there be no battle. So with his supply lines exposed to Bruce's constant guerrilla attacks, Edward was forced to withdraw to winter his forces in Berwick, angry that Bruce would not fight him. Edward needs that fight with Bruce so he can draw a line under this campaign. The attacks by Bruce against English lands, just across the border into Northumberland and Cumbria, are affecting the coffers, the taxes that the King of England can raise, but possibly more significantly, they're really, really affecting his prestige, his leadership. The nobles of England are losing faith in their king. He's not really, obviously, the general or the leader that his father was. And each one of these years that Bruce is able to go unchecked and to ravage freely about just underscores that. On top of that, these beleaguered English-held garrisons in towns that they still hold on to in southeastern Scotland, they need support. They need their English king to come in and back them up with an army. And if that doesn't happen, then obviously they become increasingly beleaguered and their foothold in Scotland becomes weaker and weaker again. So Edward's position is being steadily undermined by the continuing threat of Bruce rumbling on. Edward needs to deal with this situation, and Bruce is not giving him the chance. So rather than risk a costly defeat in a field battle with the English army, very sensibly, Bruce waited until Edward was back in Berwick before ordering his men to raid across the border into England's northern counties. He is toying with Edward. So Bruce's plan not only secured portable loot for the Scots, carried off from Northumberland and Cumbria, but it also made Edward look weak and unable to protect his subjects. This tactic forces Edward to stay in the south to try and protect his lands from attack, so he spreads his armies out to try and block these raids. And the English army stayed in Berwick until mid-1311, when Edward led them back south in England, not returning for another 3 years. So with no victory or plunder to speak of, Edward runs out of funds to pay for this army in mid-1311. The Crown of England does not have a bottomless pit of gold that they continually pay out to cover soldiers' wages. They rely on the goodwill of their barons for raising taxes and giving money and the men to put these armies together. If there's no tangible success, if there's no plunder, no booty from invasion of neighbouring kingdoms, then these armies and these lords run out of money quite quickly. And Edward can't afford to keep these men in the field. So with no tangible success against Bruce, he's forced to give in and march away with the army. And the English garrisons of southern Scotland once again have to batten down the hatches, hunker down, and try and weather the storm of Bruce's constant attacks. So, a piece at a time. The departure of Edward gave a huge boost to the morale of the Scots. 9 English garrisons were not heard of again after Edward's withdrawal, suggesting they fell shortly afterwards. Bruce's men carried a sustained series of attacks into Lothian until the region is at his mercy. And remember, Edward is not there with an army to defend this. So this is isolated towns, castles, just trying to cling on against what to them is an enemy army just freely ranging across their countryside. So the local population claimed to have suffered £20,000 in lost money, corn and cattle between 1310 and 1313. Now, obviously, to the modern mind, that doesn't sound like a back-breaking consequence for a whole region to suffer. But to put that in some perspective, £20,000 is the approximate equivalent of perhaps £12.2 million in today's money. Now, once again, that probably doesn't seem like a back-breaking amount for an entire region to bear, but money is not as plentiful in the medieval world as it is today. In 1310, to put it in some perspective, that kind of money could buy 23,500 horses, or it could pay for 2 million days of work from skilled tradesmen. That is a king's ransom. That is a lot of money. So Lothian, we can see from this then, economically must have been destroyed by these 3 years of attacks by Bruce and his men. So Bruce is just wearing the defence of the Lothians down until they get to breaking point. So Bruce and his men also began picking off the remaining English-held outposts beyond Lothian and reducing them. In 1311, they took this, Dumbarton Castle. Bruce himself led the capture of Perth, but later in January 1312, and this starts a series of really daring and just brilliant attacks and different methods that Bruce and his men employed to take these strongholds and get into these walled towns and castles. So let's hear what he did in Perth. Here the Scots pretended to withdraw and abandon their siege. Remember, Bruce's army is still small. They can't really be seen to be pinned down on one spot for too long, because then they present a target for a potential English force to come in and get them, and Bruce must avoid that at all costs at this stage. And Bruce also doesn't have the money or the resources to build or pay for siege equipment, so an attack against a walled town or city by Bruce is probably always going to be a short-term effort. So they abandoned their siege of Perth, only to return that night. Shrouded by darkness, they waded through the icy moat of the town to scale the walls with grappling hooks and rope ladders. This is Hollywood stuff. You imagine, if only they make a sequel to Outlaw King on Netflix, this would be brilliant TV. So once inside, Bruce and his men overwhelmed the surprised defenders. He executed the town's leading burgesses for resisting him. Now, a burgess in the medieval world is a businessman or a kind of wealthy townsman who has a bit more rights and a lot more wealth than your average punter in the medieval world. So these are the guys that are basically the kind of almost like city council officials that are running the show. So Bruce sets an example, and these men have to be killed. Word of their fate will obviously spread across other English-held towns and strongholds across Scotland, and they know what's coming to them if Bruce shows up, and Bruce is therefore hoping that they'll just hand him the keys rather than resisting and save everyone a lot of hassle. Now this is Castle Rushen in the background. This is a stronghold on Isle of Man, so we'll find out why I'm showing you this now. So by December 1312, Lothian was subdued enough for Bruce to lead an attack right the way through it down to Berwick, on the border of England. He again tried his rope ladders, but attack failed when the English garrison was alerted by a barking dog. So even though Bruce's plans are ingenious, they don't always work, which adds an extra spicy bit of danger, I suppose. In February 1313, Bruce's men completed the subjugation of Galloway by taking Dumfries Castle. And in May 1313, Bruce took to his ships. He landed an army on the Isle of Man to capture a strategic outpost from the English. Now, a bit more on Isle of Man and why it's important. There we are. Isle of Man, look where it is. Nowadays, it is a bit of a forgotten corner of the British Isles. To get to, you're looking for a flight or a ferry. It's pretty expensive and not visited by many. But in the medieval period, the Isle of Man is far more important. In the time that we're discussing with Bruce's campaigns, the Isle of Man is past its height in terms of its importance, really. But 100 years, perhaps even 200 years before Bruce was doing his bit, the Isle of Man was the key to the west of Britain. Sat where it is at the heart of the Irish Sea, Scandinavian raiders who sailed across the sea from Norway, from Denmark, and came as what we know the Viking hordes and the great heathen army. They took the Isle of Man and they used it as a stronghold. It was the heart of their campaigns from which they dominated the east coast of Ireland, holding places like Dublin and Waterford. It allowed them to attack into the north coast of Wales. At points they held Anglesey. And from their base in Isle of Man, they dominated the northwest coast of England. So where we see on this map from Chester as far north as the Solway Firth, just below Dumfries there, they owned that coast. And Isle of Man was the heartland of that. It also allowed them easy access to the coast of Galloway. And the Scandinavian settlers seem to have mixed freely with the local population. And even as late as the middle of the 13th century, or perhaps the 1220s, 1230s, Galloway was a semi-autonomous, almost separate kingdom within Scotland, and it is because of this heritage of the Scandinavian settlers. The Isle of Man also allowed fleets of warships access to Argyll as well, so it gave them control there. It's really tightly associated with a leader you may have heard of called Somerled, Lord of the Isles, who was a massive player in northern British politics and basically owned the Western Isles of Scotland. The Isle of Man is basically his own separate kingdom in the middle of the 12th century in the 1160s. So Isle of Man is a super important place. It had changed hands between Scottish and English ownership after the death of Alexander III. The English made a move to go and take it. So this is Bruce going in and getting it back. Some 30 years, 20 years down the line. So Isle of Man, strategically, is still quite an important place in the medieval world, and Bruce makes his move to go and get it. From here, he's going to be able to threaten the English flank. No longer does he just have to march down across the borders into northern England, he can now use ships to harry their western coast. An extra danger. So Bruce's ingenious campaigns carried on. In September 1313, Bruce's men jammed a loaded hay wagon concealing 8 armed men in the open castle gate at Linlithgow. They held off the defenders long enough to provide access for others hidden outside to rush in along the sides of the wagon and overwhelm the garrison within. It's important to remember that when we're talking about castles and strongholds in the medieval period, a garrison that basically defend these places, we're not talking an army of hundreds of men. Sometimes a castle garrison could be small. We could be only talking a couple of dozen men. All they need is to keep the gates shut and someone to man the walls and make sure no one tries to get across. It doesn't need to be lots and lots of men. So if Bruce was able to force the gates and to pile men inside that castle, then it would only be a matter of time until the relatively small number of defenders would have been overwhelmed. So this is a cunning move by Bruce and his men to jam that wagon in the gate, stop the portcullis coming down, and his men could just rush in without having to do a siege and getting ropes and ladders over those walls, which has been expensive in terms of lives lost. So this success prompted a major political move by Bruce. He issued an ultimatum to those Scots still loyal to Edward. They had 1 year to submit to him or face permanent disinheritance and the loss of their lands. Bruce is upping the ante again. Come to him or lose everything. Now this, to put that in perspective, this would have been such a difficult time if you were a minor lord, Scottish lord, living in the Kingdom of Scotland during these years, particularly if you lived in the Central Belt or in the southern part of Scotland. You find yourself the target of basically the English occupying regime, and the English might come back at any point with a gigantic army because they've got the resources to do that. Squish this pretender, squish Bruce and crush him, and then you would have to explain, if you had gone across to Bruce's side, what you were doing, what you were thinking. Why did you betray your oath to the English? Why did you turn your back? There'd be a consequence to pay to that. You may lose your life, you might lose your lands, you might have your family disinherited and lose everything that you've built for generations. Or do you go across to Bruce and if the English aren't standing up to give you your backing, then the Bruce and his men are basically attacking your lands, impoverishing yourself and your peasants. No taxes are coming in. People in your lands are being killed. You're being made to look weak because you can't protect your own people. It's a difficult time. What way do you go? There's so much to lose. So a difficult time for many people across the land. Not just the peasants who are being torn apart by war and probably famine from all these raids, but also the lords that face losing everything if they made the wrong choice. So in response to this, the people of Scotland wrote a letter to Edward appealing for his help. If they're going to hang on with these English loyalist garrisons in Scotland, they need an English army to come and back them up. Now, having negotiated a settlement with his unruly barons, finally, Edward II was in a position to intervene, finally. He wrote to his loyal supporters, praising their efforts against his enemies and rebels, and Edward announces his plans to lead an army north in midsummer in 1314. Now, Edward had come to a negotiated settlement with his unruly barons after they captured and executed his personal favourite, the Lord Piers Gaveston, the Duke of Cornwall, in 1312. So, having separated him out from his close friend, Edward II was now isolated from his nearest allies, and English lords felt they could work with him. That probably made Edward II's own position a bit weaker, and that's going to become possibly a feature of his reign, that he's always struggling for authority over the nobles and, as we'll see a bit later on, over his own household even. But during the period of 1314, things seem to calm down in England enough that Scotland needs to be on its toes. So, Edward's letter gives Bruce 9 months of breathing space to prepare for Edward's arrival. He exploited this by moving against the remaining key English garrisons in Scotland. He wants to clear the decks before Edward comes. Now, while Bruce is clearing the decks, he is going to carry on his campaign of removing all English-held garrisons that he can from across Scotland to minimise the threat to his own power when the English do eventually come. Now, this opens up one of the most intriguing episodes of Bruce's campaign to take down these garrisons. This picture here shows the remains of a city. That's right, a medieval city used to be on this peninsula. This is Roxburgh in southern Scotland. It's just upriver from Berwick-upon-Tweed, and it used to be one of the most prosperous cities in the whole of Scotland. It was basically brought low by the Wars of Independence that made it just such a dangerous place to live, that the merchants basically came to the conclusion there just wasn't enough profit to be had from continuing to live here, and the city was slowly abandoned over time. And then this is what's left. This is the remains of an entire city. You can see there's some low walls surviving on the headland there, but that's it. So let's see what happened at Roxburgh. On the 28th of February 1314, James Douglas, Bruce's loyal lieutenant, led a force into Teviotdale, and they took the walled city of Roxburgh. They snuck up to the walls under the cover of darkness at night time, disguised, somewhat amazingly, as cows. amongst the grazing herds. They must have been mingling in and out of a herd of cows. Now, the city of Roxburgh is built on a grassy peninsula, and in front of it, just down from the hill, you can see in the background there, and surrounded by a loop of the river, is a kind of riverside dale or pasture, and this would have been used as a space for those animals to graze. So it's not unusual that there would have been cows or grazing animals moving about and possibly coming up close to the city walls. So this at least would have been the norm. Having a force of armed Scots and amongst those cows, probably not the norm. So using grappling hooks and rope ladders, Douglas and his men scaled the walls and they overcame the garrison. Just as at Linlithgow, as you get over the walls, and if you can get enough men in there, the garrison are not going to be numerous enough to fight back. This reconstruction by Andrew Spratt, so watercolour here, shows something of what the walled section of Roxburgh may have looked like. Now, there probably would have been more buildings down on that pasture land as well, a more spread of the city, as it were. This is the walled enclosure on the hill on that headland. So in March 1314, Thomas Randolph and his men scaled the cliff at Edinburgh Castle as well to surprise the garrison in the dead of night. The Bruce ordered the destruction of both strongholds. Two major castles which had acted as bases for Edward's midsummer campaign were now lost to him. So Bruce is, in a way, almost following that scorched earth policy style of campaign that Wallace had used against the English in 1298 before the Battle of Falkirk. Destroy all the resources that the invading English army can have access to on the way in, and you may well just force them to turn around without them achieving anything except a big wage bill. So the implication of these guerrillas attacks then is that the Scots lack the equipment and the manpower to besiege or storm a castle of any strength. So yeah, these events, even though they're successes to the Scots, do tell us that they have flaws still in their own strength and army. The portrayal of the men who overcame these garrisons as folk heroes infers that the allegiance of the common people of South East Scotland is now switching over to the Bruce. These songs and poems about what these men achieved are not written by people who hated them and hated what was being done. So outrages committed by the English garrisons at Edinburgh and Roxburgh against the local communities, such as robbery, holding people to ransom, breaking of expensively brought truces, was alienating what little support the Anglo-Scottish regime had left. So the English, by mid-1314, are on a shaky peg in terms of their remaining occupation in Scotland. So Bruce sent his brother, Edward Bruce, the last one that's left alive, to besiege a third key stronghold at Stirling Castle. Now, if you remember from our previous video, Stirling Castle is the linchpin of the medieval kingdom of Scotland. It, from its craggy outcrop, allows control of the only real road between the south of Scotland and the north of Scotland that was any use for an army to march up and down. As it cut through the ford across the River Forth, where obviously the Battle of Stirling Bridge had taken place, and across the giant big boggy swathe of Flanders moss which covered the upper Forth Valley. Stirling controls whether or not you can access the north of the Kingdom of Scotland, so it's a key stronghold. And this time, the English still hold it. So Edward Bruce makes his move, takes an army around it, and this is the next one on their hit list. So by now, Edward's arrival was not far away. So at Stirling, both the besiegers and the besieged agreed a local truce. Edward Bruce would not attack the castle. In return, if the garrison was not relieved by midsummer 1314, it would surrender. So this seems like a happy agreement. The English garrison are not going to face a huge loss of life if the men get in. Makes conditions a bit nicer in the city as well. Edward Bruce isn't going to have a terrific loss of life potentially amongst his own men as well, because the garrison, if they stick with the agreement, are going to just basically hand him over the keys. Basically, we have two forces waiting for events to overtake them, sitting, glaring at each other, until Edward does or does not show up by the appointed day. So the siege of Stirling was not the reason for Edward's invasion, but the truce made it a goal for the king's army. It assembled at Berwick and it marched north in June 1314. Now, in contrast to the army he'd bought a few years before, now he's got the backing of the barons in England. Edward is coming with the real armed strength of England. His army numbers around 20,000 men, compared to Bruce's approximate 6,000. Edward brought with him large numbers of heavy cavalry and longbowmen who had decimated Wallace's army at Falkirk in 1298. But any Scottish spies or scouts watching the progress the English armies made their way north, this would have looked pretty grim. Bruce waited at Falkirk with his small army. As Edward approached, he moved north through the Torwood to Bannockburn, just south of Stirling. Here, he decided whether to withdraw to the west or if he was going to fight. So that's it for our content for today's video. I'm going to round off with some big questions to have a think about from what we've just learned. First one up is, why did Edward allow Bruce to systematically capture and destroy his garrisons in Scotland between 1309 and 1314? Surely that was remiss by the English king. Why was this allowed to happen? Secondly, why did Bruce use guerrilla tactics to capture the English strongholds? Think about all these amazing stories we heard about in today's video, all the stuff that would have been amazing fodder for Outlaw King Part 2 from Netflix. Fingers crossed, guys. Why? Why did Bruce not do it in a conventional way? And our last question from today's video is, by midsummer 1314, in your opinion, based on what we've just gone over, who is in the strongest position regarding Edward and Robert Bruce? Is it Edward advancing with his giant army? Or is it Bruce, after years of careful work to win the situation over to his own side? Who do you think stands in the best position in those dangerous days at the start of June 1314? Right, that's it for today, guys. Thanks very much for tuning in, and see you next time.